you all for being here. I am thrilled. Just 10 minutes or so ago, we were standing around, and you know, when you have these kind of events, it's kind of like having a reception or something, and an open thing. You wonder, you know, a lot of food's out. Will anybody show up? If not, we're gonna have a whole lot of food left over. So I'm glad you're here, at least for the donuts, and I hope you'll not be disappointed in my talk. I am thrilled and honored to be here, and thrilled particularly to be kicking this program off. If you haven't seen this lovely brochure, I was just showing someone. There are copies of it out there, Phil. So you really want to pick one up, because I've been sharing it shamelessly with friends and family and colleagues, and getting wonderful feedback. It's a most impressive program for any parish to put together, much less a university. So it's very impressive, and I congratulate the committee for their planning work, and I thank Linda Dieter for convincing me to get involved, which I was reluctant to do initially, and also Jeff Jackson for dropping my name in the bucket. I was demurring because I really don't fancy myself a C.S. Lewis scholar, per se. I did write my dissertation on Lewis, but that was some 32 years ago. So my career is taking a different direction. However, I do have a talk I'll share with you. It's called Discovering C.S. Lewis. As you probably know, some of you who are C.S. Lewis fans, you discover someone else who admires or enjoys C.S. Lewis's work. One of the first questions that comes up is like, what was the first book you read by C.S. Lewis? And then the conversation goes from there. So that's kind of where this starts. I am going to work the text, otherwise I tend to digress too much. And this is about a 30-minute talk, so I hope I can keep your attention. We all have moments in our lives that are watersheds. Some are evident at the moment, like falling in love or falling off a horse. We know at such moments that our lives will never quite be the same again. And can you all hear me okay in the back? I don't know how close I can get it. How's that? In other cases, the significance of the watershed grows over time. My discovery of C.S. Lewis was of the latter kind. Although I was deeply impressed when I first discovered him, I had no idea what I was letting myself in for. Not only had I found an author with a massive corpus that would keep me busy for years, but his writings ultimately led to major changes in my faith, my intellect, and my academic career. Like many others, I was deeply influenced by Lewis to return to the practice of Christianity. He also led me to abandon my undergraduate field of study, sociology and anthropology, and to pursue advanced degrees in English literature. Ultimately, as I mentioned, I wrote my dissertation on Lewis at Notre Dame. I'll tell you a little more about it. I continue to admire Lewis and be nourished by his writings. Today, I will give you a little more detail about how I discovered C.S. Lewis, a summary of Lewis's biography, in case you don't know, and a glimpse at my doctoral thesis, without getting into too much detail, but as a way of looking at the total corpus of Lewis from a particular angle. I first read Lewis in the winter term of my junior year of college, that was 1971, in a course on the modern British novel. Early to mid 20th century authors like Joseph Conrad, D.H. Lawrence, Joyce Carey, E.M. Forster, Graham Greene, and James Joyce. I recall enjoying the course thoroughly. Included on the reading list, however, was a somewhat unusual choice of Till We Have Faces, a myth retold by C.S. Lewis. Lewis is not generally considered a major British novelist of any period, so many would regard this inclusion as odd. Only later did I discover that the novel itself appears to be quite unlike any of Lewis's other works, or so it seemed at first. Just out of curiosity, how many of you read Till We Have Faces? Yeah, it's usually a smattering. How many of you read Mere Christianity? A little larger smattering, okay. Screwtape Letters. Okay, so we have some fans here. Well, Till We Have Faces is a retelling of the old story of Cupid and Psyche. I hope that rings a bell someplace, maybe 8th grade mythology. The story of Cupid and Psyche survives only in a book entitled Metamorphosis, or The Golden Ass, by Lucius Apuleius, a Latin author who lived in the 2nd century A.D. in what is today Algeria. The narrative relates the adventures and misadventures of a young man who is magically turned into an ass, as a donkey, not like other young men. Along with the story of Cupid and Psyche, it contains many other stories that Apuleius almost certainly retold from earlier sources. As you may recall, the story of Cupid and Psyche is a love story in which the god Cupid, son of Venus, falls in love with the ravishingly beautiful human Psyche and takes her to be his secret bride. Psyche's two jealous sisters interfere, causing Cupid to abandon Psyche, and the jealous-hearted Venus condemns her to a series of seemingly impossible tasks that Psyche nevertheless completes with some divine assistance. Psyche is ultimately reunited with Cupid, forgiven by Venus, and made a goddess, and they all live happily ever after. And of course, a highly condensed version of a delightful tale. Lewis retold the story as a sort of autobiographical complaint written by an aging warrior queen who portrays herself as the devoted elder sister of Psyche. No two sisters, just one sister. The story is set in a backwater, semi-barbaric kingdom in late pre-Christian antiquity, where the influence of Greek learning and philosophy is just beginning to seep in. Through this device, Lewis is able to dramatize a central theme of the book, namely the very modern tension between secular enlightenment and religious faith. The queen, named O'Rule, is furious at the gods for having taken her beloved little sister away from her, and then having put into the minds of various storytellers what she regards as a despicable lie that the queen had been jealous of her younger sister. The process of recalling and writing down this complaint against the gods and retelling her own life story, which she regards as highly selfless and a virtuous one, is itself a sort of spiritual autobiography, but one in which the problem of self-knowledge becomes increasingly evident. The end result is nothing short of an epiphany and a conversion experience for O'Rule, or as Lewis called it elsewhere, a blessed defeat. The title of the book comes from O'Rule, at long last realizing that her entire life has been filled with self-deception, and that her anger at the gods reflects her own failure to know herself. As she declares toward the end of the novel, "I saw well why the gods do not speak to us openly, nor let us answer. How can they meet us till we have faces?" I was curious to know more about this author, C.S. Lewis, and was thus delighted to discover the following year that the same professor who had taught the modern British novel course offered a senior seminar primarily for English majors, which I was not at that time, on C.S. Lewis and the Inklings, a group of friends and fellow Oxford scholars who met regularly, shared lively conversation, and were works in progress. It was among this group that Lewis's close friend, J.R.R. Tolkien, shared the first drafts of what ultimately became The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And most critics would agree that if it were not for Lewis's encouragement, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings never would have been published, because Lewis saw the grandeur of them, but many others didn't, and Tolkien had his own doubts. So needless to say, I signed up for what proved to be my most enjoyable college course and a major turning point in my life. I dare say that in the more than 40 years since taking that course, it would be a rare day that I did not think of something that C.S. Lewis wrote, and on most days I actually start or finish the day by reading some excerpt from one of his published works, thanks to several books compiled specifically for that purpose. Around the Year with C.S. Lewis, The Business of Heaven, and many others. In fact, you all have chosen one for reading in the Lenten period, which looks interesting. It's just out, and I'm looking forward to that. So I'll return to it until we have faces, but first I want to give you a quick summary of Lewis's biography, and will help set the stage for seeing how this last novel represents the culmination of his fruitful career as the most popular and effective apologist for Christianity in the 20th century. Lewis was born November 29, 1968 in Belfast, Northern Ireland. He was the second son of a comfortable, middle-class Irish family. His father was an attorney, or a solicitor. His mother was the daughter and granddaughter of Anglo-Irish clergymen. Lewis describes his parents' temperaments in terms that reflect an important dichotomy in his own life and his own thinking. I'm quoting, "My father's people were true Welshmen, sentimental, passionate, and rhetorical, easily moved both to anger and to tenderness. The Hamiltons, his mother's family, were a cooler race. Their minds were critical and ironic, and they had the talent for happiness in a high degree, went straight for it as experienced travelers go for the best seat in the train. From my earliest years, I was aware of the vivid contrast between my mother's cheerful and tranquil affection and the ups and downs of my father's emotional life, and this bred in me, long before I was old enough to give it a name, a certain distrust or dislike of emotion as something uncomfortable and embarrassing and even dangerous," end quote. This division in Lewis's sensibility is evident as a major recurring theme throughout his life and writings, the pull between the emotional and imaginative and the intellectual and the rational. Indeed, one writer called him a romantic rationalist. Some would say this was the source of his great effectiveness as a Christian apologist, his ability to approach matters of faith and belief from both an emotional and rational perspective. Although his skill as a rational apologist for Christianity is widely recognized, this strength is not the sole source, perhaps not even the most important source of his effectiveness. As James Como, who will be speaking later in this program, has observed, when reading Lewis's apologetic works, one thinks one is reading an argument, but realizes that Lewis is also weaving a spell. Indeed, Lewis himself admits as much in his beautiful sermon, The Weight of Glory, which he delivered in the Church of St. Mary the Virgin, Oxford, on June 8, 1941. I'm quoting again. Do you think I'm trying to weave a spell? Perhaps I am. But remember your fairy tales. Spells are used for breaking enchantments as well as inducing them. And you and I have need of the strongest spell that can be found to wake us from the evil enchantment of worldliness, which has been laid upon us for nearly 100 years. Almost our whole education has been directed to silencing this shy, persistent, inner voice. Almost all our modern philosophies have been devised to convince us that the good of man is to be found on this earth. End quote. And what is this shy, persistent inner voice? Lewis calls it joy, for him a technical term, which he describes in Surprised by Joy as, quote, an unsatisfied desire which is itself more desirable than any other satisfaction. An unsatisfied desire which is itself more desirable than any other satisfaction. He sharply distinguishes joy from happiness or pleasure, except that, like them, anyone who's experienced it will want it again. Lewis calls it enormous bliss, quoting Milton's phrase for Eden in Paradise Lost, and further says that, quote, in a sense, the simple story of my life is about nothing else, end quote. He returns to this experience of longing for something beyond our grasp as evidence for human immortality. In Mere Christianity, for example, he writes, quote, if I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Probably earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy it, but only to arouse it, to suggest the real thing, end quote. Lewis's early life was tranquil and even idyllic. All this was shattered when he was 9, and his mother died from cancer at age 46. It was, he wrote, the end of all settled happiness and security in his life. Quote, all that was tranquil and reliable disappeared. It was sea and islands now. The great continent had sunk like Atlantis, end quote. Sadly, Lewis and his beloved older brother Warren grew increasingly estranged from their father, a very temperamental man, who in his own grief was simply unable to provide the love and support that his son so desperately needed. In a real sense, from age 9, Lewis was emotionally an orphan. His close friendship with Warren was of great importance throughout his life, a source of consolation, comfort, and companionship, but also a source of great pain due to Warren's chronic struggles with alcoholism. There followed a series of unsuccessful stints at English boarding schools, the first of which resembled a madhouse more than a school, and was in fact run by a man who was later declared insane and permanently hospitalized. His father carefully checked this school out. All this Lewis vividly describes in his spiritual autobiography, Surprised by Joy, The Shape of My Early Life, published in 1955. In the others, which were less horrible, he was simply a misfit. He was brilliant, precocious, hopeless at sports, and a nonconformist. The English public schools were meant to break such as he, and he did not break. But he was miserable through most of his formal schooling. He completed his college preparatory education with a brilliant but eccentric private tutor for 2 years, and entered Oxford at the age of 18 with the intentions of being a college-level teacher, or don as they're called, and a poet. The First World War intervened. On his 19th birthday in 1917, Lewis arrived a green young lieutenant in the trenches of France. Wounded the following spring, he returned home to convalesce. The war fortunately ended later that year, and he returned to Oxford, proving himself a brilliant student. He took 2 degrees and 3 first, or highest honors, in classical languages and literature, ancient history and philosophy, and English language and literature. He was elected a fellow of Magdalen College. That's actually spelled Magdalen, but the knowledgeable people, it's pronounced Magdalen. Interestingly, the same college at Cambridge is pronounced Magdalen, so whatever. But fellow of Magdalen College, Oxford, in 1925, where he remained until 1954, when he was appointed to the first chair of medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge University. He was quickly recognized as a brilliant and formidable scholar, teacher, lecturer, one of the most popular at Oxford. His public lectures were often standing room only. Early on, he had won praise for his published scholarship on early English authors such as Edmund Spenser and John Milton. Lewis died on November 22nd, 1963, just a week short of his 65th birthday. If that date rings a bell for some of you, that was the date that John F. Kennedy was assassinated as well. And curiously, also the date of Aldous Huxley's death, all within hours of each other. Someone's actually written a book about the meeting on the other side. Discussion. I'm kidding. At the age of 13, Lewis had ceased to consider himself a Christian and thus set out on a 20-year journey of doubt, distrust, curiosity, and restless searching for that quiet voice, that joy. He did not merely consider himself a doubter or an agnostic, far from it. He passionately disbelieved in any God and regarded the universe as fundamentally evil and meaningless. At the conclusion of his long passage in this wilderness of disbelief, at the age of 33, he came to believe that this man Jesus, this obscure and troublesome Nazarene Jew, who had been crucified under a minor Roman official named Pontius Pilate in the remote territory of Judea, was in fact who he claimed to be, the Son of the living God and the Savior of the world. In the following passage from Surprised by Joy, Lewis describes how he finally came to believe that there was a God, if there is a God. Christianity was about 2 years later, which he considered a blessing. Quoting, "You must picture me alone in that room night after night, feeling whenever my mind lifted even for a second from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach of him whom I so earnestly desired not to meet. That which I greatly feared had at last come upon me. In the Trinity term, which is say spring of 1929, I gave in and admitted that God was God and knelt and prayed, perhaps that night the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England. I did not then see what is now the most shining and obvious thing, the divine humility which will accept a convert even on such terms. Who can duly adore, the prodigal son at least walked home on his own feet. But who can duly adore that love which will open the high gates to a prodigal who is brought in kicking, struggling, resentful, and darting his eyes in every direction for a chance of escape? The words compelle entrare, compel them to come in, have been so abused by wicked men that we shudder at them, but properly understood, they plumb the depths of the divine mercy. The hardness of God is kinder than the softness of men, and his compulsion is our liberation." End quote. This key passage merits careful reading and rereading. It is not only one of the most soaring pieces of rhetoric that Lewis ever composed, it provides a key concept that Lewis used repeatedly in his apologetics. For him, becoming a Christian was no wish fulfillment dream. On the contrary, it was the last thing in the world he wanted. What he most wanted in the universe was simply to be left alone. This image of the most reluctant convert in all England became one of his most frequent. It also carried with it the implication that he knew well what it meant to be an unbeliever. He had been there, but ultimately found it an untenable position. Although Lewis was among the most prolific of 20th century British authors, he does not easily fit into a single category. From the time of his return to Christianity in 1933, Lewis's literary output exploded with works of Christian apologetics, fiction, and scholarship on English literature, and other works related to his field. His more than 40 book-length works include serious literary and critical scholarship on various authors and works of late medieval and early Renaissance England. He also wrote fiction that ranges from his beloved and perhaps best-known stories of Narnia in 7 volumes, to a so-called space trilogy that follows its hero Ransom on adventures from planet Earth to Mars and then to Venus, or Paralandra as he dubs it in his invented language of Old Solar, and then back to Earth for a thrilling struggle between cosmic forces of good and evil in the unlikely setting of an outback English university town. I just said, say parenthetically, anyone who's worked in a college university setting knows that great evil and great passionate battles are not that unlikely in a small university town. In 1942, he published a slender volume of fiction known as the Screwtape Letters, which gained for Lewis worldwide fame. These are imaginary letters on the art of temptation from a senior devil, Screwtape, to his apprentice nephew, Wormwood. In 1941, even as he was writing the Screwtape Letters, he gave the first in a series of invited BBC talks on what Christians believe. More about that next week, by the way. Plug. This resulted in the book known today as Mere Christianity, which is still in great demand today. In 1947, he appeared on the cover of Time magazine, an international phenomenon recognized for his brilliant, many would say pugnacious, defense of Orthodox Christianity. Here's a classic sample, probably one of the most famous, of his either-or argumentative style from Mere Christianity. I'm so glad I have a glass of water. I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing you must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sorts of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on a level with a man who says he's a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something else. Something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, or you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to, end quote. Although describing himself as an ordinary layman of the Church of England, in his works of apologetics, he carefully avoided sectarian disputes and attempted to focus on what he called mere Christianity, what most Christians in most times and places have believed. The result has been great appreciation and admiration by Christians from a wide variety of faith traditions, as I'm sure you know. One friend observed that, quote, Lewis struck me as the most thoroughly converted man I ever met. His whole vision of life was such that the natural and the supernatural seemed inseparably combined, end quote. As an apologist, he described his task as convincing his readers and listeners of the following. This boils it down, quote, Christianity is a statement which, if false, is of no importance, and if true, of infinite importance. The one thing it cannot be is moderately important, end quote. Of course, upon my first encounter with Lewis back in 1971, I knew nothing of that corpus, very little about his life, and a great deal less than I now know about theology and the history of Christianity. At that time, I was, like many of my generation, a bit adrift regarding matters of faith. Although I had been reared as a Methodist and my mother's father was a Methodist pastor, my parents had a conversion experience when I was about 12 and later were received into the Roman Catholic Church. You can imagine the shock among our Methodist family members. Along with me and my 3 siblings, an older sister and 2 younger brothers. I was at the time, remember I was about 12, 13 when this happened. I was at the time ambivalent about this major shift as it thrust me into what then seemed an utterly alien culture. Latin, this is pre-Vatican II, too. Dominated by people who seemed to be mostly from New Jersey and held a distinctly dim view of my home state of Georgia. Now you have to realize that at the time, to be a Catholic in most parts of the South was to be a member of a very small minority group, one that was often mistrusted and even despised. This reality did not make my life as a Catholic convert any easier. At any rate, by the time of my junior year in college, I had been quite effectively seduced by what T.S. Eliot called the secular taint, and thus decided that agnosticism was the intellectually respectable position on religious issues. This afforded me the highly attractive freedom from any sense of obligation to a fixed creed, and the complacency of thinking I had an open mind. It also meant I could sleep in on Sunday mornings. As I read Till We Have Faces in the spring of my junior year, however, I had the distinct sensation of my world being unsettled. As Lewis undoubtedly intended, I strongly identified and sympathized with the narrator and her anger at the apparent capriciousness of the gods. As the story develops, however, O'Rule's perspective becomes increasingly unattractive And by the time she undergoes her own conversion experience, I had experienced something similar. It was unsettling, but not altogether unpleasant. In my confused state of mind at that time, the message of this unusual novel was a bright ray of sunlight cutting through stale fog. Reading till we have faces set in motion a line of thought and inquiry that ultimately had a permanent impact on my life and faith. As Lewis writes in Surprised by Joy, quoting, "A young man who wishes to remain a sound atheist cannot be too careful of his reading. There are traps everywhere. God is, if I may say it, very unscrupulous," unquote. Although Lewis was not a Roman Catholic, he was surely the most powerful human influence on my returning to the practice of my faith in the spring of my senior year. Like Lewis, also a somewhat reluctant prodigal. I got very lucky on that, by the way. I just walked down to the local little Catholic church, St. Patrick's, knocked on the door, this priest answered and said, "I want to talk." And so about 3 hours later, I sort of decided I was coming back with reservations. And he was a very wise and good pastor. Could have gone very, very differently given my attitude at the time. On the intellectual side, immersing myself in Lewis's works was an important step that ultimately led to my pursuing an MA and a PhD in English literature and to writing my dissertation on Lewis. The title was C.S. Lewis as Spiritual Autobiographer, a Study of the Sacramental Imagination. It's necessary that dissertation titles have a colon in the middle and be as polysyllabic as possible. Helps them get through. My thesis grew out of a question that grew increasingly puzzling as I read more of Lewis's works and more works about him, especially his works of fiction and popular apologetics. In a nutshell, it was how did Till We Have Faces, the first of his books that I had read, fit into the larger corpus of his works? The answer that I developed ultimately became the penultimate chapter of my dissertation, also cumbersomely entitled, A Language More Adequate, the Autobiographer as Mythmaker. I won't give you the details on that, but just a synopsis. I argued there and attempted to demonstrate that following his conversion to Christianity, in an astonishing cataract of creative work over the next 30 years, there was a recurring impulse to discover this language more adequate, his term, for conveying what he believed could be universally profitable, again his term, in his own private religious experience. In short, one of the central unifying elements in Lewis's richly diverse works is an autobiographical impulse, spiritual autobiography, an effort to present in a wide variety of works the way in which God worked in his own life, and more importantly, the way God works in the lives of others. This recurring autobiographical impulse is paradoxical in a man who was notable for being quite private and reserved. In fact, I'm pretty sure that if he were alive, he would argue me out on it and be really unhappy with my thesis. Lewis spoke disparagingly of those who viewed creative writing as essentially self-expression. One of his closest friends describes him as follows, quote, "At a certain stage in his life, he deliberately ceased to take any interest in himself, except as a kind of spiritual alumnus taking his moral finals. Self-knowledge for him had come to mean recognition of his own weaknesses and shortcomings, and nothing more. Anything beyond that, he sharply suspected, both in himself and in others, as a symptom of spiritual megalomania," end quote. Nevertheless, in several key passages of his writings, Lewis makes it clear that among this most private man's central subjects were himself, his conversion experience, and his moral development in the wake of that conversion. This is not to say he was confessional or subjective. Far from it. He was instead able to combine an objective tone, sometimes a nearly clinical approach, with a strong impression that he wrote from the very heart of his private religious experience. He achieved this objectivity by viewing his own story under the searching light of his Christian faith and a relentlessly sacramental imagination, by which I mean that he viewed all of human history as an expression of God's love. As he wrote, quote, "I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." Although his self was the primary subject of his autobiographical works, it was not his principal object of attention. Instead, he viewed his self, indeed all selves, as the object of divine attention and action. Quote, "We are," he wrote, "not metaphorically, but in very truth, a divine work of art, something God is making, and therefore something with which he will not be satisfied until it has a certain character, end quote. A friend of mine used to say, we're all saints in the rough. Although he repeatedly asserts in his popular apologetics that he is the primary subject, he claims to draw on his own experience in order to demonstrate the objective reality beyond both himself and the reader. He offers further support for viewing him as an autobiographical artist when he asserts, quoting, "The key to my books is John Donne's maxim, the heresies that men leave are hated most. The things I assert most vigorously are those I resisted long and accepted late." In his preface to the Screwtape Letters, he further testifies to his autobiographical sources, quoting again, "Some have paid me an undeserved compliment by supposing that my letters were the ripe fruit of many years' study in moral and ascetic theology. They forgot that there's an equally reliable, though less creditable way of learning how temptation works," quoting from Psalm 36, "My heart, I need no others, showeth me the wickedness of the ungodly." Although Lewis may rightly be accused of understating his learning, which was deep and wide, the Screwtape Letters is certainly a spiritual biography of a modern everyman figure seen from a demonic perspective. There are also unmistakable parallels between the life of the protagonist, or the patient, as the tempters call him, and Lewis's own spiritual journey. There's strong critical consensus that above all else, the Screwtape Letters, which is among Lewis's best known and most widely read book, is also a masterpiece of penetration into the psychology of a more or less ordinary man. One can hardly avoid the inference that Screwtape's patient is, as Lewis suggests in his preface, one of his many spiritual self-portraits, and that his great psychological acuity is the fruit of his own private religious experience and his struggles to overcome some of his own besetting sins. In his most explicitly autobiographical work, that is Surprised by Joy, Lewis offers unqualified testimony that his popular writings are rooted in his own personal religious experience. After recounting in some detail the nature of the social structure among the young men at the English public school he attended in his teens, Lewis begins the following chapter by anticipating an imaginary reader's objection to his failure to condemn the predatory sexual practices common among the students. Quoting again, the imaginary critic. "Here's a fellow, you say." You remember, this is the imaginary critic, Lewis imagining. "Here's a fellow, you say, who used to come before us as a moral and religious writer, and now, if you please, he's written a whole chapter describing his old school as a very furnace of impure loves without one word of the heinousness of the sin." End quote. Lewis replies to his imaginary offended reader that he refuses to, quote, "indulge in futile philippics against enemies I never met in battle," end quote. He then makes explicit the implications of his assertion by anticipating again the words of his imaginary critic. "Well, this means then that all the other vices you've so largely written about?" And he intercedes, "Well, yes, it does, and more's the pity, but it's nothing to our purpose at the moment." A little difficult to follow, very important. In addition to providing the most sweeping justification for viewing Lewis as an autobiographical writer, this passage demonstrates an important rhetorical strategy central to his effectiveness as an apologist. Like St. Augustine, he relied heavily for moral authority in his role as the returned prodigal, the redeemed sinner, and the reluctant converted skeptic. This strategy is most pronounced in Surprised by Joy, as you would expect, but elsewhere he suggests its power and significance when he explains how the Christian may properly attend to his private experience. Quoting, "The unbeliever may take his own temperament and experience just as they happen to stand, and consider them worth communicating simply because they are facts, or worse still, because they're his. To the Christian, his own temperament and experience as mere fact and as merely his are of no value or importance whatsoever. He will deal with them, if at all, only because they are the medium through which, or the position from which, something universally profitable appeared to him." Remember that phrase, something universally profitable. The concept of something universally profitable is the key to seeing how Lewis used his own personal religious experience to develop a wide variety of works and become one of the most admired and effective Christian apologists of his time, with continuing appeal today, more than 50 years after his death. It is also the key to seeing Lewis as one of the greatest, most inventive spiritual autobiographers in Western literature. As I'm sure you've discerned by now, it would be hard to exaggerate the impact that Lewis has had on my life. Although he does not stand alone, he certainly stands above all my unofficial teachers. If you'll indulge me, I'd like to close with one final quotation from Lewis that expresses very well how I feel about him. It is Lewis's tribute to his beloved Edmund Spenser, the author of The Fairy Queen, Lewis's book on that subject. He makes imaginable inner realities so vast and simple that they ordinarily escape us as the largely printed names of continents escape us on the map. Too big for our nose, too visible for sight. To our own troubled and inquiring age, this wisdom will perhaps show its most welcome aspect in the complete integration, the harmony of his mind. His work is one, like a growing thing, a tree, like the world ash tree itself, with branches reaching to heaven and roots to hell. And between comes all the multiplicity of human life. To read him is to grow in mental health. End quote, end of my talk. Thanks for your attention. So we're supposed to do Q&A for more questions? Get more coffee, take a break, or it's a great time to leave, too. Any questions? Yes, sir.
I believe you said that Lewis avoided the sort of church polity questions in the Church of England at his time and the factionalism.
Usually.
Yeah. Can you say a little bit more about that as sort of a way, because this is, I think, something that is still alive and well in the church, capital T, capital C period, and even in the Episcopal Church in the United States today?
I would say that you can find places where he did, let me try and get this. You can find places where he did indulge in some controversial subjects, probably the most inflammatory being the question of the ordination of women. And he does have a famed essay that appeared in some church publication, I think, entitled Priestesses of the Church. He was not in favor of it, as you might guess. And of course, he, I believe, died before women were ordained in the church. So he didn't avoid all of those disputes, but he did, his argument there essentially that lay aside the pros and the cons of the justice or injustice, nothing can be more divisive to Christendom than to do this. And again, it goes back to the issue of mere Christianity, which of course in a certain sense is a very traditionalist argument, theologically. I think, Lewis just simply believed and says in a number of places, particularly in mere Christianity, a phrase he borrowed, by the way, from a 17th century English writer, very popular, Richard Baxter. And Baxter meant just that. And the point he made was that the divisions, the sad divisions within Christianity are pale before the difference between Christianity and everything else. And so it doesn't behoove Christians, particularly in any public setting, to air their dirty laundry, that instead they should focus and concentrate on the areas where they have agreement, because the agreement is not some washed out, diminished thing. It's a robust and vigorous core, and it is where the defense of Christianity ought to be focused. Yes, sir.
So you brought up the women ordination. One of the complaints I've heard from a lot of people about C.S. Lewis is how conservative he was. And I just was wondering, I mean, he died in 63.
Right.
And when women were first ordained, for example, in the Episcopal Church, there was a large percentage of the Episcopal Church that thought it was wrong.
Yeah. They did prove very divisive thing.
Most of those people would now recant that belief. Do you think that there are certain kind of traditional conservative things that he viewed that if he had lived over a longer period of time would have said, well, it wasn't his
It's fun to speculate. You know, you don't know. I mean, he was 65 years old. He was an unapologetic dogmatist. I mean, he had a strong core of belief that he'd come to with great difficulty. You know, this was not some Saturday night fever that brought him to Christianity. This is a very slow, deliberate, very intellectual path, actually, which he recounts in detail in Surprised by Joy, leaving out some interesting things. The omissions are some ways almost as interesting as stuff that's there, but there are biographies to supplement that now as well. You know, he may have, I don't know. Lewis I would never want to be in a position of trying to defend everything Lewis said. I don't agree with everything he said. I agree with most of it, frankly. I mean, I find very little to dispute about Lewis. As a Roman Catholic, the issue of what his ordination is an interesting one that is lively and very timely under the current circumstances. I think leaving aside the issue of ordination until my communion allows the laity, male and female, to play a larger role in governance of the church, we're not going to be able to exercise the demon of clericalism that is at the root of these terrible things going on right now. Not exclusively in the Roman Catholic Church, of course, but it's big headlines and heartbreaking. So that's an editorial comment. You know, people do grow and change. Lewis certainly grew and changed. And it's interesting if you look at his life. After 1947, he didn't really write another explicitly apologetic work that would be compared to miracles or the problem of pain or mere Christianity or the Screwtape Letters. But he was a subversive apologist. I mean, he tried more indirect ways. I mean, you can't read the Narnia stories without knowing that he is trying to achieve an apologetic transformational conversion experience. As he put it, he said the language that we have used so long to talk about Christianity has become worn out, so familiar as to people just don't even hear it. And he referred to it as, I shouldn't eat this thing, should I? He referred to them as watchful dragons, that impeded people actually confronting the reality of the faith, both emotionally and intellectually. And part of his professed purpose in writing the Narnia stories was to steal past those watchful dragons, to try and help young people and not so young people, I didn't read until I was an adult, have the emotional experience and the imaginative experience that he believed, and come to believe, was central to accepting Christianity. As he put it, Christianity is a myth. There's just this one difference. It actually happened. And by that, he doesn't mean an untrue story. He means a kind of story that appeals to the imagination as well as the intellect. And that was the big hurdle for him to get over, which J.R. Tolkien, another colleague and friend named Hugo Dyson, helped him get over. They said, Lewis, you love mythology. You love the Norse myths. You love the Greek myths. You love mythology. And yet you're withholding your imaginative embrace from the mythology that can be most important to you. Because Christianity is a myth. With this great difference, it actually happened. And so that was a big turning point for him, actually, in his faith journey. It's not exactly where we started, your question. I like where you want to go with the text, otherwise I go all over the place. Yes, sir.
The conservatism of the 50s and early 60s that I grew up in, which reminds me a great deal of C.S. Lewis, did not have any room for other world religions. Christianity, I was taught, was the only true religion. Would that have been C.S. Lewis?
Absolutely not. In fact, I'm pretty glad you brought it up because that was part of his ecumenism, if you will. He was really very visionary in that respect, ahead of his time. He wrote a wonderful little book based on a series of lectures he gave at University College North Wales in 1941, I think. 41 was an incredible year. We'll talk about some of that next week. It came to be the book, The Abolition of Man. And his principal argument there is the reality of a right and wrong as central to the meaning of the universe. But part of his argument is that everybody knows this. You can go to any world religion and you'll find a common moral core. And in fact, he has an index in the back with quotations on various moral principles, moral and ethical principles. from Chinese, from Indian, Hindu, from Judaism. And in fact, he says explicitly in Mere Christianity that Christianity, in fact, is the only world religion that permits you to accept and recognize that all the other religions are bearers of truth, that they all are pointing to the same thing. So yeah, very much ahead of his time in that respect. Maybe one other question for time's sake, because I don't like people to feel captive, and so here's the bargain I always strike. I will hang around if you want to come up and talk a little more, but then those of you who are uncomfortable walking out when we're still doing Q&A, uncomfortably walk out. And so let's wrap it. We'll take one more question from the group. Yes, ma'am.
Actually, this is not a question, it's a comment. I was part of the Church of God in Christ for about 20 years, and when I was always interested in ministry, my bishop gave me a copy of the screw tape letters. And of course, he had a PhD, or 2 PhDs in philosophy, related to philosophy, so he was very familiar with C.S. Lewis. And that was, for me, my introduction. That was in the I guess, the late 80s that I was really introduced to that. So, and that kind of stirred me to read several of his books over that since that time.
That's wonderful. I appreciate you sharing that. And I imagine there are other stories like that in this room with people who have had those watershed moments like I did, but with many different ones of his works. It's always interesting to see kind of what the point of entry was. So thank you again for your attention. I will hang around if you want to talk a little bit more.